Thank you so much, Simon. It feels like a bit of a homecoming for me doing this in this building. This has been my fourth CRC event, but actually the whole asset recovery journey for me started, as Simon mentioned, as a criminal investigator, then as an asset manager. But it was actually in 2019, I started working with UNODC as a contractor and started working with countries, understanding the problems that they had dealing with seized assets. And that actually led to the creation of Asset Reality. So from my perspective, this is a bit of a lot to pack in 20 minutes, but we really want to walk through what some of the challenges and the opportunities are. A bit about us, just to set some context, our NASCAR slide, as they call it. We solely focus on making it easier to seize assets at Asset Reality. We build capabilities for investigators and asset recovery practitioners so that anyone, no matter how limited their knowledge is of crypto, can effectively dispose, sell, convert, return, seize, all of the things in that life cycle dealing with crypto assets. We're all practitioners. We're not academics. We are not here we don't work for the private sector. We only do this for government agencies or court-ordered asset instructions. So collectively, and some of my colleagues are in the room, we've investigated, seized, managed billions of dollars, everything from the first Silk Road seizures in the United States through to, as Simon mentioned, some of the early digital asset seizures and dealing with things like Monero in 2018 and 2019. So we've got the battle scars to prove it effectively. And basically what we're trying to do is just make it faster. It's a very complicated process when you're actually trying to seize assets. Crypto is a bit like sort of dog years. You don't have days and weeks and minutes. Everything moves rapidly. And also every year I have this conversation about seized assets. So we're able to share different trends and different patterns that we're seeing in the industry. And because there is now a really mature, excellent network of custodians, of liquidation providers, the bit I'm interested in is that first part. The bit that happens before you get to the custodian. Who's the tow truck? Who's the person responsible for that early part of the seizure? And just really unpacking a lot of that process. When we actually look at what is driving a lot of this, of course we seize assets as a global law enforcement community, but there's an additional focus now coming. This is off the back of reforms and suggestions that have now made their way into mutual evaluations. So all of your countries will be getting assessed over the next 4 or 6 years, specific questions around your seizure capability. Can you effectively and expeditiously seize assets? So it's coming down the line as a big result of what has been happening at FATF. There we go. And we often talk about asset recovery. There's almost a forgetting of the word recovery in asset recovery. And that's what I'm keen to sort of dig into. I mean, the really effective part is dismantling organized crime groups, taking away their wealth. Going to prison is an occupational hazard for many. So actually being able to seize their assets. So I'm interested in focusing on the going after the money and actually taking it off them. What we're seeing also is the coming together of a very disparate and sort of fractured process. There's no one thing that I can really put my finger on to say, this statistic we've all heard, it's hotly debated, but it's low, whether it's exactly 1% or less than 1%. But it's estimated that of the trillions that are laundered in illicit financial flows every year, as a global community, we recover less than 1%. So it's a very, very small fraction of a giant number. And it's why are we in this situation? And if we zoom in on digital assets, it's important to understand the wider landscape. There's not a problem seizing crypto. There is a problem seizing assets. And if you don't have an infrastructure to seize assets, it's just going to get much, much harder when you're trying to do your first crypto seizure. The way I try and think about it is that if you can seize cars, you can seize crypto. Many governments talk to us and will ask for advice on setting up that process and say, we want to go and build a program to seize crypto and change legislation and change policies and do these things. You don't actually need it. If you can seize cars, you can seize crypto. You can seize intangible assets. But what you want is refined policies and processes and clear guidelines to seize them effectively. And crypto seizures are just going to become more prevalent. There was a great report from TRM Labs sort of showing that cases that weren't crypto cases to begin with, more and more digital assets are emerging. And again, it's like anything. It's if you look for it, you will find it. And if you're not looking for it in your jurisdiction, that's why you will not have many crypto seizures. So when I try and walk through the actual ecosystem and put myself in the shoes of somebody who's maybe responsible for building a seizure program, for somebody who might be doing that first crypto seizure, for example, in their agency, I can get why it seems overwhelming. Again, things change so much. I look back at my notes from my first presentation 4 years ago, and many of the companies on this slide now didn't exist or were in their infancy. We didn't properly exist then. We were just a bunch of consultants back then. So when you try and navigate, it's understanding who the different players are in the ecosystem and understanding what tools do you need. It's not enough to build an effective program to say, it's okay, I bought an analytic tool. That's one really important part of the overall ecosystem. The way I sort of think about it is that if you imagine the analytic companies, I mean, they're your satellites, they're your telescopes, they're the things that can use all of this intelligence and information and data and help us find assets that we want to seize. Companies like TaxBit then, where you've got your aggregators of on and off chain data, combining what you're seeing on the blockchain with real world financial information. Then you're into, once you've seized it, the big companies, the big custodians, the Coinbases we heard earlier, from Nick, who have the US Marshals contract. I know the guys from Comania here who have the UK contract. Les is speaking after me and Wave. So we have this wealth of solutions now. It's the epitome of public and private partnership. But again, trying to navigate that. And we can't buy our way out of the solution or out of the problem. You can't just buy a bunch of licenses for different tools and think it's okay, we're covered. So I thought I would use today, and just to quickly go through some of the different problems that we see, some of the issues, and now this new and emerging trend as well, where we're talking about the deployment. You'll hear me talk about deployment a lot going forward in all of our LinkedIn rants and our podcasts that we do. Because think about it, the biggest crypto seizure cases in the world traditionally have one thing in common. They were started by fantastic undercover operations, test purchases. You cannot take down the dark net actors without getting onto the dark net. You cannot get into the dark net unless you've got data. And I'm not talking about test purchases. I'm not about buying access to a Telegram chat. And I'm saying all of this as if I have any clue what the hell I'm talking about. There's much more clever people than me in our company that do that. But it's understanding the sort of barrier to entry. I can seize and sell diamonds without being a gemologist. So it's also not being intimidated by the academic barrier at times in this sector. And just thinking about that life cycle. I mean, do you have the tools in place to actually effectively seize assets and manage assets? So we'll walk through some of the pain points that we've seen for the countries that we support, anonymously, of course, just to try and share best practices and look at how other people have navigated the different problems that they're facing. See my trusty clicker. Yeah, so for me, as I said, I think that we're missing in the ecosystem, the tow trucks, and that's sort of why we exist. It's that gap. You do not want to be that person that one of my colleagues has been in that seat where they've given someone a crypto address because someone has called them from the agency and said, doing a crypto seizure today, send me the address quickly. So you send them the address and then you look and say, I have $1 billion in my home on a Saturday night. And that's becoming more common, not $1 billion necessarily, but the amount of agencies that we come across where someone is doing the seizure and it's kind of like kicking in a door, finding the diamonds, and then not having a process in place to actually safely, would you keep those diamonds in your pocket? Would you bring those diamonds and keep them in the office? And some jurisdictions have the fortune of having a dedicated asset management office, but many jurisdictions don't. And it's another global push we're seeing from a FATF point of view. There's an EU directive specifically that all countries in the EU or countries ascending into the EU must have a designated authority for asset management. Now, that can be within a unit. It doesn't have to be a standalone agency, but we've seen phenomenal examples in France and Belgium where we have dedicated agencies. Netherlands, for me, has one of the best systems for managing assets effectively. So it's how do we sort of rinse and repeat this? And what are some of the sort of pain points when people are sort of seizing crypto? You don't know what you don't know. And the amount of people that have contacted us and saying, hey, we're going to do the seizure, then I'll give you a shout when we're finished. Right. Have you done the seizure before? Do you have that sort of jump team or those people that can say, I have done this, I can walk through this with you, I can be on a Zoom call and sort of hold your hand a little bit? It's not to be patronizing, it's just to share that joint navigational data. It's showing you how to get there and how to avoid some of the pitfalls that we see. And again, I don't expect you to be able to read these, but it's just about, we talk a lot as an agency around pre-seizure planning. It's a word and a term that's thrown about. The UNCAC and the UNODC, I think in 2017, 2018, talked about 14 effective markers and 14 non-binding guidelines for effective asset management. Number one is pre-seizure planning. So think about that for your $400 million vessel. Think about those big cases, the 1MDBs of the world where there's billions of dollars of assets potentially. Do you have a plan in place? Is it pre-seizure planning or is it pre-seizure panic? Because with crypto, it is unforgiving. I mean, the boat's not really going anywhere. If you can see it and you can have some people with machine guns standing outside it, you're pretty set. Whereas we've seen cases where someone has seized crypto, and by the time they've got back to the station, the crypto was gone because someone else had a copy of the private key. It's like seizing the key of a car, jumping into the squad car, driving off, thinking it's fine, and somebody else turns up with a spare key. And it happens all the time. And because it's on chain, you will then be the agency that the press is talking about. There are blockchain analytic companies that pretty much, it seems to me, exist to embarrass law enforcement. Some of these boutique houses that are like, hey, these guys have seized some crypto. Hey, they suck at selling it. It's their entire job and they sell data. So it's about, if something goes wrong, you're going to be caught. You're going to see this. So we want to try and help people avoid that and also be really realistic about the challenges around this. I think it was Emma's great presentation earlier. Emma mentioned things like address poisoning. That wasn't a term that I used 2 years ago in a presentation, let alone last year, let alone 4 years ago. So the whole guidance about check the first 5 and check the last 5 before you send the transaction. Do you know now that there's tools and software that you can create vanity addresses? So when I see the seizure taking place and I see the address in your court order, and I know that you're the agency that manages assets, I'll set an alert to watch your address. And the minute you send a transaction and I go, that's the test transaction, I'll generate my first 5 and last 5 to be identical. The stuff in the middle is made up, pops into your wallet, small transaction. And if I catch you, you're just going to hit cut and paste like everybody does. And everybody checks the first 5 and last 5. And there's been a lot of public cases where law enforcement has actually come forward and said, this happened to us. No, don't let it happen to you. Again, it's not embarrassing for the agency. This is a brand new sort of frontier of asset seizure. So there are these mistakes and some of the practical things. If you're seizing a Ferrari and you don't have petrol, you'll use a tow truck. What do you do in crypto when you're trying to do a seizure or get assets out of the wallet and you don't have the gas fees or the tokens necessary? It's a very practical problem that it might be really difficult for you in your agency to be able to buy some crypto to move the other crypto assets. So just solving some of those really practical problems. We see ourselves as a bit of a virtual gas station to help people, and also knowing some of the tricks to try and front run transactions because there'll be things like malicious smart contracts that when you're trying to do the seizure, you're setting off alarm bells that you're seizing someone's assets and other assets are on the move. So it's just knowing, and again, this is not new to law enforcement. If you're going after an organized crime gang and there's 10 suspects, you don't raid the first one and then an hour later go after his friend and an hour later go after the other friend. But we see that in crypto seizures, that they're done sequentially. And by the time you've done the first one, all the other wallets are emptied. So it's just about having that sort of coordination available. And then post-seizure, the considerations. It's a horrible place to be if you're the person using spreadsheets to manage thousands of crypto addresses. So just on a practical time-saving basis, and again, happy to unpack this over coffee because I appreciate I could talk about this for days, but it's around what system do you have? You don't need to go and buy expensive software. If you're doing your first crypto seizure, of course you can use a spreadsheet. Of course you can do that. But if you're trying to build a program so that multiple officers around the country are able to go out and seize assets effectively and have other people controlling it, it's about understanding, do you buy software? Do you build software? And that's something that we discuss regularly. Some of the big challenges we've seen, how do you audit assets? The OIG in the United States, the auditor, produced quite a substantial report into the US Marshals. And again, it's not to be critical of the US Marshals. The people that built the program work with us now. They just don't have the tools. They're relying on legacy systems that don't have on-chain monitoring, for example. So again, but those reports, I would recommend you download and read it if you're in the seized asset world, because there's really good sort of feedback points on things to avoid. Again, spreadsheets are only so scalable. But also we've seen a lot of cases where officers involved in the actual seizure, whether it was a moment of madness, whether they're falsely accused, but we've seen lots of cases around the world where the people tasked with managing the assets have stolen the assets. And corruption, I'm an anti-corruption lecturer in Luxembourg for the International Anti-Corruption Academy. It happens a lot. It's just a reality of any large organization is going to have corruption challenges. So we want to try and get away from legacy systems. We want to try and have better, effective ways of dealing with seized assets, but we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the problem. The very report from this entity in the building we're sitting in back in 2017 was talking about it's difficult to manage seized assets and we're not making the revenue we could out of the assets we are already looking after. So that was something that we were tasked with. One of the countries we worked with said, we need a better seizure program. We're in trouble with FATF. And we basically implement an asset manager model. So that's the way we're solving it for them. They work with us. We then become the interface for all these sort of wonderful custodians and solutions that are available. So again, that's the same model you would use if you were seizing cars. If you're selling real estate, do you sell it yourself or do you appoint an estate agent to sell the house? So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And again, more than happy to talk in the coffee break around how you can use things like the modern wallets that allow you to add multiple layers of governance so that you don't have to have one person in the office that has the private keys or two people geographically separated. Using different wallet technology, you could have 20 people on the signing instructions and use apps to authorize it. So there's lots of different ways. And that's something that we've been involved in building out. A portal to allow people to manage assets better and have all your physical assets and digital assets in one place. As part of our commitment to sort of UNODC, any developing jurisdictions that don't have the funding, we have a program available for unpaid pilots for those to just try and help them. If anyone wants to ask us, we're more than happy to chat about that. And my last shameless plug is we have a seized asset training is getting launched this very month. Again, there's a free version for those countries that can't afford because we don't want there to be a barrier to entry. So you can ask myself or the team about that. Happy to dive into any questions. I think I'm on time. Monica warned me she would kill me if I ran over, especially the first one back after the break. So this normally takes me about 40 minutes to say this, so you owe me. So I'll stop there. Yeah, please, I'll jump in. Where's it on here? It's not on this. Oh, is it not? Can you put it on this screen? Wonderful. Here we go. How can authorities properly deal with procedural documentation? We still this being very manual. Yeah, I think there's really good practice around the world. There is one of my colleagues was involved with World Bank and STAR. They put out a guidance document on the effective management of seized and confiscated assets. But I think until we move, and you've got these wonderfully sophisticated digital forensic tools, blockchain analytic tools, data aggregation tools, but then we're still using spreadsheets. So I do think that it's an investment that agencies will need to make. But I also appreciate coming from the UK, we have the Joint Asset Recovery Database. I mean, it's an old system. In the US, they have a CAT system. They're old legacy systems. So I think that until we actually start to, jump into the sort of with both feet, the sort of technological solutions, you can make your life a lot easier because trying to do this on spreadsheets when you have thousands of assets is just an impossibility. What do you think about manually opening devices to search crypto wallets during the execution of a search warrant? Again, tread with caution. If you need to know what you're looking for, that's not my field. I don't know. When you're thinking about, we hear people talking about, we're going to sweep the wallet, or we have the seed phrase, we can reconstruct it. Again, that's like opening the door and letting everything flood in. Unless you know that there is no malicious smart contracts, it's about understanding what it is you're dealing with. It's like seizing a lion. I would make sure you have a handler with you. Time for one more? One more? Isn't it expensive for law enforcement agencies to get private firms involved in managing seized assets? How does it work? Great question. In the 7 years that I was the asset manager for a number of UK law enforcement agencies, the cost to them is nil because the criminal pays for the pleasure of assets being seized. If you seize a criminal's asset, it's baked into legislation all around the world. The cost of this recovery, storage, and realization of the asset is borne by the criminal. House gets sold, solicitors' fees, attorneys' fees. So when we're actually working with agencies, we get paid out of the criminal's proceeds by just getting a percentage relevant to the asset portfolio. So what you would expect to see on a Lamborghini would be very different on $1 billion worth of crypto assets or real estate. So those pricing models allow you to do that. Obviously, there's complexity when it's victims' cases and assets being returned or international sharing agreements. But around seized assets 101, the de facto is usually it just comes out of the actual pot of assets itself.